A tale of two halves as Tottenham come back from two down to draw against Manchester City. So let's get straight into Tottenham 2, Manchester City 2. So this was the team that Thomas Frank went with, a real mix and match of the 11. But this sort of back three that I guess we've seen out of possession in terms of shape for Tottenham. We've seen that against Dortmund and shades of the Burnley game from what I did catch, and obviously the Frankfurt game. And, you know, to be fair to Thomas Frank, I think you do sort of have to look at the last few games and say there had been a bit more of a shift in terms of being a little bit more attacking, but I still feel like we're so far off. But yeah, this was the team he went with. Obviously, a doggy on the left side, and with Spence now injured, that was a no-brainer. Archie Gray sort of filling in this sort of right-back role. They've got it down as a 3-4-2-1, but I think it was more like this. It was probably a bit more like this, where you'd have, the three at the back, then you've got the four across, Simmons in the 10 just behind Solanke and Kolo Muani. So that's the team that started the first half, and yeah, wasn't a good first half. But as we mentioned, this was a game of two halves. But yeah, let's get into the game and have a look at where I think we were good and where I think we were really, really bad. Now, on commentary, when I think Gary Neville said it's his first Spurs game for a few years, and from the outside, for someone who, like Neville, is a complete neutral when it comes to Tottenham games, he was saying about he was so shocked at just how bad that first half was. But if we're honest, we've seen that sort of performance 15 to 16 times already this season, and there were real shades of this game which reminded me of the Villa Cup game. And I think the difference really is that we just got that equaliser against Man City, but it was almost a complete carbon copy of that Villa game, because we started so poorly, and then quickly we're 1-0 down, and then as soon as the second goes in, Man City didn't even get out of second gear or even third gear in that first half, and somehow we're 2-0 up. And I don't think, I say somehow like it's a huge shock, but it's not really when you're playing against literally the best manager in the world with a team with unlimited resources. I know Man City, we are sort of their bogey team, but you can't just give that much space, that much time on the ball to a team like Man City, because they'll pick you apart without even trying. And that's what it did in the first half. And when you're thinking about Man City, I think you can definitely look at them, admire how good they are, how good the squad is, how good the manager is, but you can also look at it and say they aren't that team that won the treble a few years ago and then won the league the year after, and they're in a bit of a weird transitional phase, but they're still a very dangerous team. And the way we played in the first half, it was just completely hopeless. There was balls going up top, and every time we entered Man City's half, it was just about win a foul, win a set piece, get up the pitch a bit. And yes, that is good game management to a certain extent, but you can't be just relying on that as your sort of attacking rhythm. And I feel like we did in the first half, and that's why Xavi Simmons wasn't as good in the first half. I think that's why Solanke wasn't as good in the first half. But for Gary Neville to be so shocked, it sort of speaks to, I guess, a sort of ignorance towards Tottenham fans, in that from the people who don't have to watch this week in, week out, they'd be looking at that first half and they weren't really shocked. And it was almost like the boos that come at half time, even then from the fans, it was almost like we've become so accustomed to it that even the boos were a bit half-hearted. And I think we're in a really sticky place at the minute, and I think that Thomas Frank is probably going to get the rest of the season, and I purely put that down to the fact that in the last few games we've seen marginal progress in terms of showing a bit more of an attacking identity, something that I've harped on about all season, but we've seen a bit more of it. I still don't think it's anywhere near enough, but I feel like the board, I feel like they're ready to give Frank time. And if we're looking at it, he could have been gone in November after the Chelsea game. He could have been gone the week after the Arsenal game. All the other sort of results we've had, West Ham as well, all of these results, for me, have shown that Thomas Frank probably isn't the guy at Spurs, and there's very, very small green shoots that have come in these sort of, I don't know what you call them, these sort of in-game scenarios when we sort of just have to go, full throttle and just throw everything forward, and that's when actually we look a bit better. That's when players like Xavi Simons look a bit better. And when you go from a group of players that were managed by Postecoglou, and for 2 years it was all about every time you get the ball forward, always looking to play forward, always looking to attack, always looking to be the pragmatist. Yes, it didn't really work out under Postecoglou the way that I think any of us envisaged after those first 10 games. I still think overall his time at Spurs was a success, purely because of that Europa League trophy. But, when you've had 2 years of that being sort of in your mind, it just being reinforced back to you, I feel like that's the sort of football that these sorts of players really thrive in, and I don't think it's a coincidence that games like Villa, where we were 2-0 down at half time, games like yesterday, when we went for it a bit more and we were a bit more gung-ho, it feels like that's when we sort of get the best out of these players. And ultimately that was, for me, I think the difference, it was that going into that first half you had everything to lose, and Thomas Frank's mind and the sort of approach that we had was all about staying in the game, being defensively solid, not giving City anything. We give them quite a lot, and we weren't defensively solid, and we weren't really in the game. So Thomas Frank's game plan went out the window at 2-0, and with Spurs coming forward, making a change at half time with Romero going off, and basically having nothing to lose, that played into our hands, and I think that did against Aston Villa as well. And that's got to be the blueprint going forward. I know you can't just throw everything and just go gung-ho, attack from the first minute, because you'll get caught on the counter, and that's what we've seen under Postecoglou. But there is a perfect halfway house, whether you're, pro Frank and anti Ange, or, vice versa. I feel like the right manager for Spurs is just somewhere, if this was the scale, I'd say if you've got Thomas Frank this end and you've got Postecoglou this end, I feel like you need a manager who leans more towards the Postecoglou sort of approach, but just with a little sprinkle of Thomas Frank pragmatism. And if that manager is out there and is stupid enough to want to come to Tottenham, then I think that's a perfect manager for us. Who that is, I don't know. I don't get paid the millions to identify these people. But as fans, that's the sort of approach that I feel like we need to have moving forward when it comes to our next managerial appointment, if Thomas Frank doesn't turn this round. I touched on it briefly there, but Xavi Simons was so much better in the second half than the first. And there's an element of, yes, I know you can't always be the pragmatist, and you do need to adapt sometimes and react to how the opposition is playing or how the opposition is lined up. But that first half and the second half, it was almost like a glimpse into Xavi Simons' Spurs career so far, and the second half being elements of Xavi Simons' Spurs career that we have seen, but a glimpse into the future and the sort of player he can be in the right system. And this is something that I've been saying all season, and I don't think it's a coincidence that when we have a lot less to play for and there's less jeopardy, that Simons and the rest of the team play better. And that could be due to the mentality, or that could be purely down to the fact that that's just sort of the way that Thomas Frank's setting up. But either way, when we're playing more attacking, Xavi Simons has got something about him, and he's going to be a real fan favourite. And he's had moments this season. I'm thinking of the Dortmund game, the sort of Slavia Prague, Brentford game, those sorts of games where we've seen that in the right system he does click. And I just feel like Simons isn't alone in this, but a lot of our attacking players, we're just not getting the best out of them. And if we set up from minute one, a bit more attacking, a bit more identity going forward, more patterns of play going forward, using all areas of the pitch instead of just the wings, then that's how you're going to get the best out of Xavi Simons. And he really, really was good yesterday. Rode so many challenges, and I think Rodri. There's a few where Rodri was definitely lucky to stay on the pitch. There was quite a few sort of little kicks at Simons. Maybe if that's gone past him, and I feel for him a little bit, Simons. Not just because of sort of the setup and sort of start he's had to Spurs, but in these games when he's playing well, because he is, a young lad who's come from a foreign league, who's, this player who's done it in foreign leagues, and now he's coming to the big bad Premier League and all this sort of narrative, whatever you want to spin it. He rides so many tackles, and the amount of times where he gets past someone, it's a clear foul, and it's just not given. And I know that I'm sort of, straying into the sort of Arsenal fan territory where I don't want to, do that whole sort of rigmarole where they're saying that referees, referee Simmons differently, because I don't think it is as deep as that, but he just is unlucky in the way that, when he's on a counter-attack, the amount of times he's sort of brought down or pulled and then sort of let go of the shirt just as referee's about to blow. That happens a lot to Simmons, and I think it's a testament to his character, the way that he sort of just rides these challenges in a metaphorical sense and also a physical one. But that's really encouraging. We've seen players come in for that sort of money before. I'm thinking the likes of Tanguy and Ndombele, who, yes, are not necessarily the same position, but ability wise, Ndombele had something about him, and it was more to do with the application and the attitude as why it didn't work out for Tottenham at Spurs. And Simmons coming in for a similar price, every single game you'll see him, he comes off the pitch with that white shirt with big patches of green, big patches of brown, where he just hit the turf and he's got back up and keeps going. And that is such an encouraging sign for Tottenham fans, and it shows that he's really bought in, even when, as a creative player, when your individual game is stifled by the sort of team approach. I think that's really encouraging for Xavi Simons, and he's got such a bright future at Tottenham. And obviously, alongside Xavi Simons, there was another standout player for Tottenham, and that was Dominic Solanke. And Solanke is one of them players which I feel is really, really sort of the public perception around him, especially for most Spurs fans. I don't think he gets enough credit as he should do. I think his first season, really impressive, 16 goals, goals against the likes of Chelsea, Man United. He scored in both the away fixture and the League One. Scored a brace against Villa. Scored it in Bodo. Integral in our Europa League run. And I think the biggest issue with Solanke so far, for me personally, is that it's just the availability which has been the problem. And I don't think it's a massive coincidence that, whilst I've hinted at saying, Spurs have looked a bit more better going forward, I think it's been since that Dortmund game when Solanke's been fit, he's been leading the line, and I don't think Thomas Frank is abstained from any sort of blame because of the way that we played this season. I think a large portion of the blame is to go on him, but also, by the same token, if we're going to be fair, Solanke's not really been available, and Richarlison, yes, probably suits Frank's style of play a bit more, where it's more direct, more balls into the box. But he doesn't have the hold-up play of Solanke. He doesn't have, he doesn't press the same way as Solanke with as much intensity. And I really feel like Solanke is by far our best option going forward through the middle. And, from the first half, we didn't really see too much of him, and I think that was purely down to our approach and the fact that we were playing with so much caution in our game. And even the first goal, it come off of Gahey, I should say. It did come off him, but it was almost a reward for his hard work, because that was by no means a clear-cut chance. When the ball comes to him, he really had to work at it and really fight for it in battle. And then that second goal was just amazing. It was such a good finish, and it's not a goal that we've seen a lot at Spurs. I'm struggling to think of a goal that we've seen similar to that. and I think aesthetically pleasing. The fact Donnarumma gets a hand on it probably means that the goal isn't as great as it should be, while still being a great goal. But Solanke's made such a difference, and we've looked like a better team since he's been back, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Going forward, I think next year we definitely need reinforcements going forward, whether that's someone to upgrade on Solanke or someone at a similar sort of levels for them to really compete head to head. But he just adds a bit of quality that Kolo Muani isn't showing, and that Richarlison we know doesn't really possess in terms of all-round game. Solanke's hold-up play, he gives you more of an option, and I said about winning fouls and things like that, and that was sort of our hope in the first half in terms of going forward. But Solanke was integral to that, and the amount of times that he'd get bullied about in terms of like just pushed off the ball unnecessarily, things like sort of dark arts that our defenders do to other attackers and all that sort of thing. He did that great, and after playing that first half, I was looking at the players thinking they are not playing for him at all, and that second half completely shut down that sort of school of thinking for me, because I don't think it was just Solanke. I think with the change with Romero coming off, which hopefully we're hoping is not an injury and that it's nothing too serious, with him coming off, I think Simmons looked better, Gallagher looked better, Basuma looked better, Solanke looked better. When we're playing front-footed attacking football, when because there is an heavy reliance on duels, and if you're going to be fair to Frank, you'd say that Klopp had a similar importance placed on second duels and had a lot more of an industrial midfield rather than anyone of like significant quality across Europe, and we don't have that quality by any means. We are nowhere near reaching the sort of heights that Liverpool did under Jurgen Klopp. That's not what I'm saying, but when you are further up the pitch and you're in people's faces, that's when winning these second balls and these duels are more important. And I don't think it's a coincidence that when we played with a bit more emphasis in attack, when we pushed a bit higher up the pitch by 5 or 10 yards, pressed a bit higher, that the likes of Conor Gallagher, these all-action midfielders, looked better. The likes of Solanke, where he leads a press and really, really doesn't give the goalkeeper or the defenders time of day. Players like Xavi Simons, who like to get the ball and make oppositions uncomfortable, and it's a lot easier to do that when you're higher up the pitch and further in their territory than trying to play a sort of pressing game when you're camped on the halfway line and you can't really get into the opposition's half. But some other sort of mentions from the game, I thought Radu Dragusin really, really struggled, and it's a tough one with Dragusin because I don't think he's looked comfortable in a Spurs shirt ever since he's arrived, and I think a lot of that, maybe unconsciously, will be the fact that his agent is always just speaking in the public about Dragusin and potentially moving on ever since he's come, and he's not helping Dragusin at all, because as a fan, you'd look at that game yesterday and watch someone like Dragusin's performance in that first half, and it essentially makes his agent look a bit silly when he's just asking for more game time and putting in those sorts of performances. But I feel that's sort of beyond Dragusin's control. That's probably an issue closer to home with his agent, but I thought he struggled yesterday, and it looks like he's going to stay, but a lot of the reports have been that he's been wanting out from Tottenham this transfer window, and it looks like he's not going to get that, so maybe that's one we reassess in the summer. But I don't think game time's going to be a problem for Dragusin at the minute, with Romero's injuries, the fact that João Paulinho's having to fill in at centre-back, the fact that Kevin Danso's injured, Van der Ven's injured. Dragusin is going to get more game time over the next sort of coming weeks. We just need to see a bit more from him, for me. So the transfer window shuts tonight, actually in a few hours, and I just thought we'd have a little talk about Spurs' window so far. So Gallagher's come in and Sousa's come in, and two areas which admittedly we needed, but it's still not enough. And I know there is this thing about January, and you can't get as it's not as easy to do deals naturally because of the restricted time frames. But with this, I'm sort of looking at this tweet which was put out, and it was from an aggregator, but essentially Alistair Gold, and this isn't obviously anything that Alistair Gold can control. From what he was sort of the reports coming out of the club, this is the sort of January transfer window that Spurs are expecting. So left wing is a priority next month, as well as potentially adding a midfield and a centre back. So this first sentence here, left wing is a priority next month. Early before the window, we've seen a lot of noise coming out that Spurs were ready to change their wage structure for a player like Antoine Semenyo, and that left wing position was going to be a priority. And it's clear that we were interested in. Thomas Frank has said as much, in the sort of pre-match press conference, to say he would have been a great signing, and I don't think anyone's doubting that. Semenyo would have been a great signing for Tottenham, but ultimately it's not been done. And we knew from the first few days of January that Semenyo was going to Man City, and there has been no other links at all with any sort of left winger. So in terms of how much a priority it was, you sort of have to question that when Spurs are saying so much that it's going to be left wing is the position they're going to target. But as soon as Semenyo was sort of off the table, we've seen nothing, and that is really, really worrying for me. The fact that if left wing is such a priority, why have you only got one person that you're sort of assessing for that role? Because it might just be that all the links have been really protected by the club and they just weren't able to get that done. But I'm thinking probably tomorrow or the day after there's probably going to be a video on Tottenham's sort of social media pages, and it'll probably be Vinay or Johan Lange talking about how January's always hard and we had targets coming into it but we weren't able to get it done, that sort of thing. So left wing, didn't get anyone for that. Adding a midfielder, so with Conor Gallagher we have added a midfielder to our ranks, and I don't think a player like Conor Gallagher, we're not really in a position where you can turn your nose up to that. But what I will say is the need we had for a midfielder was for a very, very specific type of midfielder, because across the board, I think if you look at our midfield, you've got purely options, you've got Bentancur, Basuma, Sarr, Bergvall, Gray, Paulinho. That's already 6 centre mids. And then you also add into the fact that, once everyone's fully fit, Maddison's probably going to be in there, and maybe Kulusevski. We've seen that before under Ange. And, Kulusevski isn't really a centre midfielder, but you know what I mean? He can play as that sort of left 8, number 10, that sort of thing. And the need that we had for Spurs is quality rather than quantity. And we've got a lot of midfielders who can do a little bit of everything, but aren't necessarily a natural at one specific thing, like a defensive midfield, for example. And Gallagher, whilst he is good and is a good signing, in terms of attributes, let's just disregard quality. In terms of attributes, I don't think it moves the needle at all for us in terms of the profile that we need for a midfield. And I think going into the summer, that need for a DM who can get moves going and is quite comfortable on the ball with good pass and range whilst also being good defensively, that sort of becomes a bigger priority, despite the fact that we've signed another midfielder. And it's not Conor Gallagher's fault. I think given this sort of situation we're in with Bergvall facing long-term injury, Bentancur, Sarr being away for AFCON at the time, Gray having a few injury issues, Paulinho having a few injury issues, the need for a midfielder was there, and that's why we've seen Yves Bissouma come back in the team. But I just feel like whilst we did need to add a midfielder, the profile of it was a bit gung-ho, I think, and I feel like it's an opportunistic buy, which is good from the club to, whilst we're in need of a midfielder, to have Gallagher in and to be addressed and to be a player of that quality, but didn't see it. A centre-back, didn't see that. A natural left-back will be sought either now or in the summer. Now, Sousa has come in. There were links with Andy Robertson as well. And, I'm not gutted that Robertson's not come in, but the way I see it is, and this isn't a slight on Sousa, it's more of a damning indictment on the club and their sort of structure and plans approaching transfer window. Is that yes, Sousa has come in, and he's by all means is a talented left back by sort of some of the things that I've been reading from the likes of Tim Vickery, that he really does have a future and he could be a great left back. So I think that's good on that front. But the other side of that coin is that with the games coming up, we've got big games in the Premier League. Arsenal, Man United, Newcastle, as well as the games to come in the Champions League, and still Chelsea and Liverpool left to play this season. And my concern is, if we were in a Champions League quarter-final, for example, and a Doggy wasn't fit or Spence wasn't available, for Spurs to ask a 19-year-old left back coming from literally a different continent, can't speak the language, to be able to effortlessly slot in at left back, even in the Premier League against the high-end clubs or against the Champions League against a very elite, that is a big ask of a 19-year-old, and it's not really that fair on Sousa, because I think then he's almost thrown into the deep end, not given time to adapt to a new club, a new culture, a new city, that sort of thing. And if we had someone like a Robertson, who, maybe they are sort of towards the twilight of their career, but still a dependable, solid left back that can come in and deputise in the absence of either Jed Spence or Destiny Udogie, I think that would have been a really good move. But we didn't get it. So now, the only natural left back that we've got outside of Udogie is Sousa, and I think that's just asking a bit too much of him so early on in his Spurs career. And then there's also this one, Spurs move for a striker. The club, or one of many sides across Europe, eyeing up Samu Agahoa. Obviously, Porto striker who was at Atletico Madrid. Didn't see literally anything to do with that, if I'm honest. Players will be allowed to depart for the right price, with Johnson and Dragoshin looking for game time and having price tags that have not fallen. Johnson, I think we've done well to replace him. I think that's very un-Spurs-like in the way that we almost cut ties quite quickly after around 2 seasons, and getting that resale value. So I don't begrudge the club for cashing in on Johnson. I think going into the second half of the season now, after the transfer window, not replacing last year's top scorer, and the fact that Mohamed Kudus is out, as well as Kulusevski, who can play on that right hand side, that is negligent. That really, really is negligent. And we said, it's almost like we almost give the club too much credit in terms of saying, January is a hard window. People are in place to look at transfer windows and recruitment and that sort of thing, and you've got 2 windows each year. You've got the winter and the summer window, and it almost feels like we get to around the 15th of January, and then we start to look at players. And I know obviously we signed Conor Gallagher and Sousa, but what we needed is basically not what we've got. And Dragoshin, he's not gone out the door either. Sort of touched on him, and I think this is the real sentence. It's expected to be a key upgrade area in January midfield. And Gallagher is a good addition, but I wouldn't say he's a key upgrade. And people that are campaigning again for change for Tottenham in that group, and everyone who's unhappy with ENIC, we've all seen this. And it's not to go full Alan Partridge, but it is a rebadge. And I'm sat here, and I'd love to think that the new ENIC and the new sort of Lewis family that's going to be in charge of Tottenham, I'd love to sit here and give them the benefit of the doubt, but so far from what we've seen, you'd have to say that they failed this window, because look at all the things we've mentioned. Left wing's priority, we didn't get that. Adding a midfielder, yeah, we did get that. Didn't add centre back. Added a left back, but probably could have done with more experience on that left, as well as Sousa, to sort of allow him to sort of simmer in the slow cooker of Tottenham. Didn't see anything about Samu Agahoa coming in. Johnson left, Dragusin didn't, and there wasn't a key upgrade in January. You could probably look at all of Gallagher's sort of attributes and say, yeah, when you compare him to the other sort of midfielders, that would be an upgrade, but just not seeing it. And I wasn't hoping for much this transfer window, but at the same time, I've been left a bit disappointed and a bit like we could have done more, and that's sort of been the story of Enoch at Tottenham, whether it be this window under the new sort of, new face of Enoch rather than Joe Lewis himself. But I just feel that I don't think there was loads of business going on between the club sort of top clubs anyway, but this was our chance just to, if Thomas Frank is the guy that Vinay Langer, Paratici will think he is, and he's a manager to back, then you've got to say he's been let down regardless of your opinion on Frank. And you think of the noise going into this transfer window around the club about Fabio Paratici moving on, and the fact that he was going to Fiorentina, but he's probably going to stay till Spurs to help us with the window. I'd like to say I'm shocked, but I'm just not, and it's almost this sort of drop in standards and drop in expectations, and the sort of normalised disappointment to fans when it comes to us going that extra mile and trying to steal a march on these other clubs. We've just not seen it again, and it's been the story of Enoch at Tottenham, whether it was the son and daughter of the Lewis family, or whether it's Joe Lewis himself. It's just not changed. And for me, until something does change at the top, I can't see us kicking on and really being in the mix for a Premier League, for example, as an outside shout. Someone like Aston Villa now, they've spent money, but it's not been huge £80 million signings or anything like that. I feel like it's just about being clever in the transfer window, and we've just not done that at all. So there you have it. Transfer window shut. Spurs are going into the start of a new month with a result which probably, if we're going to be real with ourselves, is probably the worst possible result we're hoping for, in terms of Man City dropping more points in a title race, Spurs not getting a win, and maybe if you are on the Frank out sort of far down that line, which I'd probably say I am, you'd say that it's another result which keeps him in a job. But to be fair to Frank, he changed it at half time. I think with Romero coming off and bringing Sarr on, Sarr was really good, and you've got to say that his changes made a difference. And as much as I will scold Thomas Frank about what he gets wrong, you have to give him some credit for the things he does get right. And that second half, his changes changed that game for us. But next up is a trip to Old Trafford. It's a ground where we sometimes get results, sometimes don't, but they're looking like a team with more confidence. They're someone who's got rid of their manager and has reaped all the rewards for having an interim in charge. I don't think that the sort of Spurs alumni have as much of a profile tactically as someone like Michael Carrick. So you could, if you're playing devil's advocate, you say who would be that person to come in, but then I'd also counter that and say most people would probably be an improvement on this. But either way, we're going to Old Trafford, and we're hoping for something a lot more like the second half, but I imagine we'll probably take too long to get into that gear, and ultimately it'll be too late. But I'd love to be wrong. I'd love to be sitting here with a smile from grinning ear to ear, but we'll see what happens. Next up, trip to Old Trafford to face United, and hopefully we can get 3 points. Until then, up Spurs.